The blade was cold against Odin's palm, colder than the frozen roots of Yggdrasil surrounding him, colder than the darkness that pressed him from all sides. The All-Father's hand shook, and for the first time in centuries, he felt something he thought he'd forgotten. Pure, primal fear. Not fear of death. He'd made peace with that long ago, but fear of what comes after you gain the knowledge you've been desperately seeking. The knowledge that changes everything. The knowledge you can never unknow. Mimir stood before him, ancient and unmoving, his eyes reflecting something that might have been pity or perhaps amusement. The guardian of the well had seen gods come and go, had seen them beg and plead and offer treasures beyond counting, but he'd never seen one willing to pay the real price. Until now, last chance to turn back, All-Father. Mimir's voice echoed to the cabin like stones grinding together. Once you drink from my well, once you see what I see, you'll spend every remaining day of your existence wishing you hadn't. Knowledge isn't power. It's a curse wrapped in pretty words. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Odin's jaw clenched. He'd come too far, sacrificed too much already, and the answer he sought lay just beyond this final, terrible barrier. But before we understand why he said yes, why he pressed that blade to his own face, we need to go back. Back to where this obsession started, back to the moment everything changed for the king of Asgard. 3 years earlier, Odin had done something forbidden. He'd tortured a Vanir sorcerer, not for information about troop movements or battle plans, but for something far more dangerous. He wanted to know how to see the future, the real future, not the vague prophecies the Norns whispered in riddles. The sorcerer had laughed even as he died, blood bubbling from his lips, and with his last breath he'd told Odin about the Well of Mimir, beneath Yggdrasil's deepest root, where even the light of the 9 realms cannot reach. There sits a well that shows you everything, every choice, every consequence, every moment from now until the end of all things. But Mimir doesn't trade in gold or prayers or promises. All-Father, he trades in sacrifice, real sacrifice, the kind that carves pieces out of your soul. Go if you dare, but know that every god who sought his wisdom has come back changed, broken, or hasn't come back at all. Odin had dismissed it as the ravings of a dying man. But then the dream started. Night after night, he saw the same vision, a massive wolf, jaws wide enough to swallow the sun, its eyes burning with hatred older than the mountains. Those jaws closed around his throat, and he felt his life drain away while his sons fought and died around him. Asgard crumbled, the Bifrost shattered, and the 9 realms descended into chaos. He'd wake up gasping, his wife Frigg reaching for him in the darkness, asking what was wrong. But how could he tell her? How could he admit that the All-Father, the one who was supposed to protect them all, was having nightmares like a frightened child? The visions grew worse, more detailed, more vivid. He started seeing things during the day, flashes of fire and blood superimposed over the golden halls of Asgard. During a feast, he'd look at Thor and see his son lying motionless, poison dripping from his beard. He'd watch Baldur laugh with his brothers and see a spear of mistletoe piercing his heart. The future was bleeding into the present, and Odin was drowning in it. He consulted the Norns, the 3 sisters who weave the fates of gods and men. Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld sat at their loom beneath Yggdrasil, their fingers moving through threads of destiny with practiced ease. They didn't even look up when Odin approached. "We know why you're here," Urd said, her ancient voice crackling like dry leaves. "You want to know if Ragnarok can be prevented. Can it?" Odin's voice was harder than he intended. Skuld smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "The threads are already woven. All-Father, we don't create fate, we simply give it form. What will be, will be." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer we have," Verdandi replied, finally meeting his eyes. "But if you truly want to see the pattern yourself, if you want to understand the tapestry we're weaving, there is one who can show you, though we wonder if you have the strength to bear it." "Tell me?" The 3 sisters exchanged glances, and for a moment, Odin thought they wouldn't answer. Then Urd spoke, her words careful and measured. "Mimir sees what we see, but he sees it differently. Where we see threads, he sees the whole cloth. Where we see moments, he sees eternity. His well reflects not just what will be, but what could be, what should be, and what must be but his price is absolute, and it's different for everyone. We cannot tell you what he'll ask, only that you won't want to pay it." That conversation had haunted Odin for months. He threw himself into other pursuits, tried to distract himself with battles and politics, and the endless responsibilities of ruling Asgard. But the visions persisted, growing stronger, more insistent, until he could barely tell the difference between what was happening now and what would happen later. He snapped at his advisors, grew distant from his wife, and started spending his nights alone in his hall, drinking and brooding and staring into fire as if it might hold answers. Thor noticed first. His son had always been perceptive beneath the bluster and bravado, and one night he'd cornered Odin in the armory. "Father, what's happening to you? You're not yourself. Mother's worried. We're all worried. Talk to me." Odin had wanted to tell him everything. Wanted to grab his son by the shoulders and scream that they were all going to die, that everything they built would turn to ash, that no amount of strength or courage would change what was coming. But instead, he'd simply said, "I'm fine, just tired. The way of the crown, nothing more." Thor hadn't believed him. Odin could see in his eyes, but his son had nodded and left, and that somehow made it worse. The lie sat between them like a wall, and Odin added it to his growing collection of regrets. The breaking point came during the winter solstice celebration. All of Asgard had gathered in the Great Hall, feasting and drinking and celebrating the turning of the year. Odin sat on his throne, watching his people laugh and dance, and suddenly he saw them all as corpses. The vision slammed into him with physical force. The hall in ruins, bodies scattered across the floor, blood pooling between the golden tiles. He saw Heimdall with his throat torn out, saw Tyr missing both hands instead of just one, saw Freya cradling the broken body of her son. He'd stood up so abruptly that the entire hall fell silent. Everyone stared at him, confusion and concern written across their faces, and he realized he was shaking. "I need air," he managed to say, and walked out before anyone could follow. That night, standing on the ramparts of Asgard, looking out over the glittering lights of his realm, Odin made his decision. He would find the Well of Mimir. He would pay whatever price was asked. Because living with this uncertainty, this constant terror of the future, was worse than any sacrifice could be. At least that's what he told himself. The journey to the well took weeks. Yggdrasil was vast beyond comprehension, its roots extending through all 9 realms and beyond, into places that had no names and followed no rules. Odin descended through layers of reality, passing through caverns where time moved differently, where the walls whispered secrets in languages older than speech, where things that were neither alive nor dead watched him from the shadows. He wasn't alone on his journey, though he wished he was. A raven followed him, black as midnight, its eyes far too intelligent for a simple bird. It never spoke, but Odin knew what it was, a piece of himself sent to bear witness, to remember what happened here in case he didn't survive. He'd always been paranoid like that, always planning for the worst, and now the worst was exactly what he was walking towards. The deeper he went, the stranger things became. He passed through a forest where the trees grew downward instead of up, their roots reaching toward the sky that didn't exist. He crossed a river that flowed with liquid starlight, its current pulling at his mind instead of his body. He walked through halls carved from solidified screams, where the walls echoed with the last words of the dead. And then he found it, the well. It sat in a cavern so vast he couldn't see the ceiling, surrounded by roots the size of mountains. The water inside was perfectly still, reflecting nothing, a circle of absolute darkness in the center of the earth. Next to it stood Mimir, and Odin finally understood why even the Norns spoke of him with respect. He wasn't a god. He was something older, something that existed before gods had names or purposes. His face was ageless and ancient at the same time, neither young nor old, neither kind nor cruel. He simply was, and that was somehow more terrifying than any monster Odin had ever faced. "All-Father," Mimir greeted him, and his voice carried harmonics that made Odin's bones ache. "I've been expecting you. The well told me you were coming. It tells me everything. Then you know why I'm here. I know why you think you're here. You want to see the future, to understand Ragnarok, to find some way to prevent your death and the death of your realm. But that's not really what you want, is it? What you truly want is control. You can't stand not knowing. Can't stand the idea that there are forces in this universe greater than yourself. You want to pull back the curtain and see the machinery of fate, to find its weaknesses, to break it apart and rebuild it in your image. The accuracy of the statement hit Odin like a fist. Can you show me or not? Mimir smiled, and it was the saddest smile Odin had ever seen. I can show you everything. Every moment from now until the end of time. Every choice and consequence. Every path taken and not taken. One drink from my well, and you'll understand the universe in ways no god has ever understood it. But there's a price, and I need you to understand what you're truly asking for. Name it. Gold, magic, artifacts, whatever you want. Those things mean nothing to me, All-Father. I don't want your treasures or your power. What I want is something far more valuable. Something you use every day without even thinking about it. I want your eye. Odin had expected something terrible, but hearing it spoken aloud still made his stomach clench. My eye. Your right eye, to be specific, but not just a physical organ. An eye is more than flesh and nerves. It's how you see the world, how you interpret reality, how you understand your place in creation. When you give me your eye, you're giving me your perspective, your way of seeing. You'll drink from a well with the eye that remains, and you'll see everything through that new lens. But you'll never see the world the same way again. The person you are now, the All-Father who came down here seeking answers. He'll die in this cavern. Someone else will walk out. The raven on Odin's shoulder let out a low croak, and he felt its claws dig into his flesh. A warning, a plea, turn back. But he'd come too far, sacrificed too much already. The visions were getting worse, the weight of the unknown future crushing him more with each passing day. What was one eye compared to the salvation of Asgard? How do I know you're telling the truth? Odin asked, how do I know the well will show me what you claim? Mimir's expression didn't change. You don't. That's part of the sacrifice. Faith, trust. You have to believe that the price you're paying is worth what you'll receive, even though you can't know for certain until after you've paid it. That's what makes a real sacrifice instead of transaction. Odin stared at the well, at that circle of perfect darkness, and felt the future pressing down on him. All those visions, all those nightmares, all that terrible knowing but not knowing would end. He'd finally understand, finally see clearly, finally be able to act instead of react. He reached for the knife at his belt, the same knife he'd carried into 1,000 battles, and pulled it free. Wait, Mimir said, and Odin froze. Before you do this, I need you to understand something. The well doesn't just show you the future, it shows you the truth. And truth is not the same as hope. You came here thinking knowledge would give you power, that understanding fate would let you change it. But what if it doesn't? What if you see everything, understand everything, and realize you're completely powerless to stop it? What if the price of wisdom is accepting your own insignificance? I'll take that risk. Will you? Mimir stepped closer, his eyes boring into Odin's. Because I've stood at this well for longer than your precious Asgard has existed, and I've seen what knowledge does to gods. It breaks them. They come here seeking power, and leave carrying a burden that slowly crushes them into dust. You think you're strong enough to bear it, but they all think that. They're always wrong. Odin's hand tightened on the knife. Are you trying to talk me out of this? No. I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're choosing. Because once you drink from this well, there's no going back. You can't unknow what you'll know. You can't unsee what you'll see. The visions that plague you now will seem like pleasant dreams compared to what's coming. So I'm asking you one final time, All-Father, is this really what you want? The cavern fell silent, except for the distant drip of water, and Odin's own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He thought about Frigg, about how she looked at him with love and trust, believing he could protect them all. He thought about Thor, so strong and brave, but so unprepared for what was coming. He thought about Asgard, golden and glorious, doomed to fall unless someone could change the pattern. And he thought about himself, about the god he'd become, paranoid and obsessed, and slowly going mad from visions he couldn't control. The choice was simple: lie with uncertainty or die with knowledge. He'd never been good at accepting things he couldn't understand. Odin raised a knife to his right eye. The pain was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Not just physical, though that was bad enough. The blade cutting through flesh and nerve and the socket screaming as he dug deeper. But there was another kind of pain, a spiritual agony, as if he was cutting away part of his soul. He felt something fundamental tear loose, felt a piece of himself die, and for a moment he almost stopped, almost pulled the blade away, almost ran back up to the roots of Yggdrasil, and tried to forget any of this had happened. But Mimir was watching, and the well was waiting, and Odin had never backed down from anything in his life. He cut deeper, felt the eye come loose, and with a final jerk, he pulled it free. Blood poured down his face, hot and sticky, and the pain was so intense he couldn't even scream. He just stood there, shaking, holding his own eye in his hand like some grotesque prize. "Into the well," Mimir said quietly. "The sacrifice must be complete." Odin stumbled forward and dropped the eye into the dark water. It sank without a sound, disappearing into depths that might be infinite, and something in the well responded. The water began to glow, soft at first but growing brighter, and Odin felt a pull like gravity, like destiny, drawing him closer. "Drink," Mimir commanded. "Drink and see." Odin cupped his hands, dipped them into the glowing water, and brought it to his lips. The liquid tasted like starlight and ashes, like the birth of galaxies and the heat death of the universe. It burned going down, burned in his veins, burned in his mind, and then the world exploded into clarity. He saw everything, not just Ragnarok, though he saw that in detail so vivid it was like living it. He saw the whole pattern, the cosmic joke, the terrible truth that Mimir had tried to warn him about. Fate wasn't a chain to be broken. It was a web, and every attempt to escape it just pulled you deeper. He saw himself try and prevent his death, saw every desperate plan and scheme and sacrifice, and he saw how each one led inexorably to the same end, Fenrir's jaws closing around his throat. But worse than that, far worse, he saw what came after. He saw the cycle repeating, the worlds being reborn, the same mistakes being made again and again. He saw that Ragnarok wasn't the end but a transition, and that everything he was fighting to save was supposed to die. It had to die, because that was how new things were born. He was trying to prevent not just his death, but the birth of a new world. And in doing so, he was committing a crime against the very fabric of existence. The knowledge kept coming, relentless and unstoppable. He saw his children's fates, saw the betrayals and battles and heartbreaks that awaited them all. He saw Baldur's death and knew he'd be the one to set it in motion through his attempts to prevent it. He saw Loki's transformation from friend to enemy, saw how his own paranoia and manipulation would drive the trickster to madness. He saw Thor's final battle, saw his brave, foolish son choosing death over surrender, and knew there was nothing he could do to change it. And then, most terrible of all, he saw himself, not as he was, but as he would become. The all-seeing God, the hanged God, the wanderer, the liar. He saw himself sacrificing everything and everyone in pursuit of a salvation that didn't exist. He saw himself becoming cruel and calculating, treating his children like game pieces, manipulating fate even though he knew it was futile. He saw himself hanging from Yggdrasil for 9 days, stabbed with his own spear, another sacrifice for another scrap of knowledge. He saw himself creating the Valkyries to gather warriors for a final battle he knew he'd lose. He saw himself lying and scheming and plotting, all while knowing it was pointless. The worst part was understanding why he'd do it anyway. Even knowing the future was fixed, even knowing every action was futile, he'd keep trying because that was who he was. He couldn't stop, couldn't accept, couldn't surrender. The knowledge wouldn't free him. It would imprison him in a loop of his own making. When the visions finally stopped, Odin collapsed to the ground, gasping and shaking. His face was still bleeding, his empty socket throbbing with pain, but those physical sensations seemed distant and unimportant compared to the weight now crushing his mind. Mimir had been right. He'd traded one kind of torment for another, and this one was infinitely worse because now he understood exactly how powerless he truly was. "Now you see," Mimir said, and there was genuine sadness in his voice. "Now you understand what I tried to tell you. Knowledge isn't power when the knowledge you gain is that you have no power at all." Odin struggled his feet, his remaining eye wild and unfocused. "I can still change it. I saw the paths, saw the choices. If I just make different decisions, if I prepare better, you'll do exactly what you saw yourself doing. That's the cruelest part of prophecy, All-Father. Knowing the future doesn't let you change it. It just means you'll watch yourself fulfill while believing you're fighting against it. Every choice you make to prevent Ragnarok will bring it closer. Every sacrifice will be meaningless, but you'll keep making them anyway, because you can't help yourself. The truth of those words hit Odin like a physical blow. He wanted to argue, to rage, to reject what he'd seen, but he couldn't, because he'd seen his own future, and he knew Mimir was right. He'd spend the rest of his existence trying to change the unchangeable, knowing with absolute certainty that he'd fail. Why? Odin whispered, "Why show me if there's nothing I can do?" Mimir's expression softened slightly. Because you asked, because you demanded it, because every god who comes here thinks they're different, thinks they're strong enough to bear the burden of truth, and because maybe, just maybe, understanding your powerlessness is its own kind of wisdom. Not the wisdom you wanted, but the wisdom you needed. Odin looked down at the well, at the dark water that had taken his eye and given him sight beyond sight, and he laughed. It was a broken, bitter sound that echoed through the cavern like shattering glass. He'd come here seeking salvation and found damnation instead. He'd wanted control and discovered he'd never had it in the first place. The raven on his shoulder spread its wings and cawed, and Odin realized it was time to leave, time to return to Asgard, to his wife and children and responsibilities, carrying this new and terrible knowledge. Time to begin the long, slow process of becoming the god he'd seen in the visions, calculating, manipulative, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone in pursuit of a goal he knew was impossible. But before he left, he had one more question. The eye I gave you, what will you do with it? Mimir smiled. It rests at the bottom of the well, All-Father, still watching. While you're remaining, I seize the present world. The eye in the well sees all of time. You sacrificed half your sight to gain complete vision. The irony is exquisite, don't you think? Odin turned away without answering and began the long climb back to surface. With each step, he felt the weight of the future pressing down harder, felt himself changing just as Mimir had promised. The All-Father who had descended into the roots of Yggdrasil was gone. In his place was something colder, harder, more desperate. A god who knew too much and could do too little. The journey back seemed shorter somehow, as if the universe itself was eager to return him to his fate. When he finally emerged into the light of Asgard, Frigg was waiting. She took one look at his ruined face, at the empty socket where his eye had been, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Odin, what happened? What did you do?" He looked at her with his remaining eye, saw her concern and love and trust, and knew he'd eventually betray all of it in his desperate attempts to change the future. He saw himself pushing her away, keeping secrets, sacrificing their family on the altar of his obsession. He saw it all, and it made him want to weep, but instead, he simply said, "I found what I was looking for." She reached out to touch his face, to comfort him, but he pulled away. He couldn't let her close, not anymore, because now he knew how this story ended, and the closer she got, the more it would hurt when he had to use her as a piece in his cosmic game. Better to start building those walls now, to begin the transformation into the cold, calculating god he'd become. "Odin, please," she whispered. "Talk to me. Whatever you learned, whatever you saw, we can face it together." He wanted to believe her, wanted to tell her everything, to collapse into her arms and let her carry some of this burden. But he'd seen that path too, seen how sharing the knowledge would only spread the poison. So he lied, the first of countless lies he'd tell over the coming centuries. "It's nothing. I gained wisdom, that's all. I can see more clearly now than I ever could before." She didn't believe him, he could tell, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she just stood there, watching with eyes full of worry as he walked past her into the golden halls of Asgard. His realm, his responsibility, his doom. That night, alone in his chambers, Odin looked at his reflection in a polished shield. His face was a ruin, the empty socket already beginning to scar over. But that wasn't what disturbed him. It was his remaining eye, the one that could now see through time, that showed him the truth. When he looked at himself, he saw not just who he was, but who he'd become: a manipulator, a schemer, a god who'd sacrifice his own children if he thought it might change his fate. The worst part was knowing he'd do it anyway. Every terrible choice, every betrayal, every sacrifice, he'd make them all because he couldn't help himself. The knowledge hadn't freed him. It had enslaved him to a future he couldn't change. And so began Odin's true torment. Not the loss of his eye, though that pain never fully faded. Not the visions of Ragnarok, though those haunted his every waking moment. But the knowledge that every action he took, every scheme he plotted, every sacrifice he demanded, was part of a pattern he'd already seen play out. He became paranoid, distant, cruel, not because he wanted to, but because he'd seen himself do it. The prophecy was self-fulfilling, and he was powerless to break the cycle. He created the Valkyries to gather the greatest warriors, building an army for Ragnarok even though he knew they'd fall. He manipulated Loki, pushing his blood brother toward betrayal, because he'd seen it happen and couldn't figure out how to prevent it. He became obsessed with runes and magic, seeking more knowledge, more power, hanging himself from Yggdrasil in another desperate sacrifice, always believing this time would be different. This time he'd find the answer. But there was no answer. There never had been. The well had shown him the ultimate truth. Fate is immutable. Struggle is futile, and wisdom is just another word for despair. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. Odin watched his children grow, watched events unfold exactly as he'd foreseen, and felt himself hollow out from the inside. He became the god the myths described, wise but harsh, powerful but paranoid, always watching, always planning, always knowing it wouldn't matter in the end. People who saw him in those later years spoke of his piercing gaze, how his single eye seemed to look right through you, seeing past and future simultaneously. They were right, but they didn't understand the curse that came with such sight. To see everything is to lose the ability to hope. To know the future is to rob the present of meaning. Baldur's death came exactly as Odin had foreseen it. The mistletoe dart, Loki's manipulation, his son's body on the funeral pyre. He'd known it was coming for years, had tried everything he could think of to prevent it, but every action had only brought the moment closer. When it finally happened, when he stood watching his beloved son burn, all he could think was how perfect the well's vision had been. Every detail, every tear on Frigg's face, every crack in his own heart, precisely as he'd seen it. The knowledge didn't make it hurt less. It made it hurt more, because he'd been living that moment for centuries, dying a little more each time he remembered what was coming. And still, he kept fighting, kept planning, kept sacrificing, because that's what the well had shown him doing, and he couldn't break the pattern no matter how hard he tried. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, a prison built from knowledge and foresight, and the desperate, futile belief that somehow, some way, he could change what he knew couldn't be changed. That's the real reason Odin has one eye, not because he traded it for wisdom, but because wisdom demanded a price far steeper than physical mutilation. He gave up his ability to see the world as it is and gained the curse of seeing it as it will be. He traded hope for certainty, possibility for inevitability, and the cost of that exchange consumed him piece by piece until nothing remained but the hollow shell of God going through motions he knew were meaningless. The myths call him the All-Father, the Wise One, the Seeker of Knowledge. But those who truly knew him, who saw past the titles and the power, recognized him for what he really was, a warning, a testament to the danger of seeking answers to questions that should never be asked, of demanding knowledge the universe meant to keep hidden. Because in the end, Odin learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes ignorance isn't weakness, it's mercy. Sometimes not knowing the future is the only thing that makes the present bearable. Sometimes the price of wisdom is the ability to live, and what you gain in knowledge you lose in humanity. His eye sits at the bottom of Mimir's well still, watching everything, seeing all the time flowing past in an endless stream. And somewhere in Asgard, a one-eyed god sits on his throne, counting down the days until Ragnarok, knowing exactly how it will end, knowing he'll fight anyway, knowing every moment of suffering between now and then. That's why Odin is one-eyed. Not because he was brave enough to pay the price, but because he wasn't wise enough to walk away.